Let's have a little fun tonight. Let's try to figure out what is the truth about modern Russia. You're certainly not going to find out by listening to the American media or our famous think tanks who are anything but. And what I'm going to do tonight is a little bit unusual, I think, because I've actually been doing business there for a long time. And two of the ventures I'm going to describe have been successes and two have been failures. So within the description of each one of these, I'm going to try to weave some of the more general topics that people are interested in, like corruption and corruption. And, when you travel, you're frequently foreign. And being from New Jersey, I'm kind of out of sorts most places I go. And corruption comes naturally, so I don't feel out of sorts there. Anyway, so we've got four businesses: a mutual fund, which Dave mentioned, an oil and gas company actually based right here in Denver, Colorado, a life insurance company launched into the Russian domestic market in 1998, and finally the leading Russian internet company. And I just think it's interesting to, hear from somebody who's actually been there and worked with government officials and worked in the marketplaces and sold products and either succeeded or failed. And by the way, it's not easy doing business in Colorado, I'm sure. Doing business anywhere is a tough assignment, and we don't always succeed. So as I mentioned, the mutual fund I've really found fascinating. I started it because Russia collapsed in 1998. And it was too bad because it was right in the middle of the launching of democracy under Boris Yeltsin. I wish I've got a couple of assigned readings for our next meeting. And I wish people would read the history of Yeltsin's life written by Harvard professor Timothy Colton, because Yeltsin was actually a great man who did not drink until he was into his 40s. His family were old believers. They didn't smoke, drink, or swear, which is why he didn't like Gorbachev, because Gorbachev was extremely profane. But when Yeltsin came into this higher echelon, and I've seen it in Washington, people began to give him booze, and he was under a lot of tension. He made a lot of promises to people when he became the president of the Russian Federation. He freed prices, instituting the free market system. He let go of the constituent parts of the Russian Empire, creating 14 other new countries, and he instituted the institutions of democracy. So the man was really, and he didn't have very good help. I mean, Ronald Reagan had Jim Baker and George Shultz and all these terrific people, but Yeltsin did not have very good help. Anyway, so the period when he ruled, so to speak, was very chaotic, and it kind of gave democracy and actually capitalism a bad name at that time. But just after the collapse is when I started my mutual fund because, as you'll see later, my other business was kaput. And when you're running an insurance company, it's half an investment company anyway. So when the stock market started in 1996, we were making investments in equities and not just the fixed income, which was the government T-bills. So the story in Russia with the mutual fund in these past 12 years has been the one that you see in emerging markets generally, which is the rising middle class. It's a very positive story. You're talking about, I don't mean to sound politically incorrect, but you're talking about white European, highly educated people who just didn't have a chance. Another required reading for tonight's meeting is a brand new book from a Yale professor named Schneider called The Bloodlands, the land between Hitler and Stalin. And this is, we all know about the Holocaust, which obviously was awful, but it was awful all over that area. And 1 million people a year died for 15 years. And so they came out of this period, in a very debilitated state. And one of my first points that I want to make about making comparisons to Russia today is to think properly in terms of country groupings. And this is a very hard idea to convey. The OECD does statistics based on where countries are located in terms of their per capita income, Russia fits with Mexico, Argentina, Venezuela, Malaysia, Latvia, and Turkey. So we're in the 13,000 to 15,000 a year per capita income range. And if you can think in terms of Russia in that category, I think it'll help you deal with some of these issues I'm going to touch upon, like corruption. How do they compare to other countries in that category? And some of these other topics we're going to touch upon. In any event, when we started the mutual fund, then we're looking at this rising middle class, rapidly rising middle class, people who've been so disadvantaged in a totally dysfunctional system. The operative element of communism was that the inputs exceeded the outputs. In other words, Russia, Inc. was operating at a loss year in and year out. They were destroying their own economic fabric in the country. And you see it in agriculture with the Black Earth, the famous heartland of Europe in the 19th century for the breadbasket of Europe and so forth. They just, the system just destroyed everything. So they basically gave up. And we saw the privatization of a lot of what had been government ministries. And people are used to thinking, well, you know, they gave away oil and gas. Well, that was true, and who were they going to give it to? Because foreigners were the only ones with monies. So they gave it to Russians. So, yes, a lot of people shouldered in and got possession of these valuable assets. But one industry that was clearly, and everybody knew at the time worldwide, was bankrupt was steel. It was worthless. Who wanted a steel company? Well, steel is the hero of my book. Published by John Wiley and Sons in 2008. And if you look at the history of these guys who got a hold of the steel companies, and they used the cash flows to replace the old open hearth furnace factories where it took 6 to cook a batch of steel, and they put in oxygen reduction and electric arc furnaces where you cook a batch of steel in 40 minutes. This was classic capitalism at its best. And they turned the steel companies into extremely valuable world-class companies. And so I cite steel because our mutual fund tries to pick winning sectors, first of all, top-down, macro. And in the early decade, it was telecom and utilities, Energos, the public utilities. And of course, telecom, you had 2 private startups that were never government ministries. They were private from the get-go. Norwegian Telecom sponsored one, Deutsche Telekom sponsored another, and these have been great companies. They've grown tremendously. The market is fully penetrated now. They're not my favorite stocks today. The favorite stocks are steel, fertilizer, and retail, and always oil and gas. So when you think in terms of the rising middle class, and the fact that the Russians were moving up rapidly from a low base, the one other kind of thought I want to ask you to think about when we think about Russia in the correct manner, which is the country grouping they're in. Many of us in this room can remember France after World War II, totally debilitated. And then they worked themselves back into the prosperous democratic market economy. In Japan, totally on its rear, changed systems and became a democratic free market economy. So I ask you to think about Russia coming up from the bottom when it had defaulted on all its debts in 1998 and became a free market, and today, yes, a democratic system. And I'm probably the only person you will ever hear say this. But having been in politics and having been in business, I've been on the board of public companies, general counsel of the New York Stock Exchange Company. And as you can tell from Dave's recitation of my CV, I really can't keep a job for any length of time. But, when you get to be 70 years old, I guess you've done a few things. So anyway, I think I know a good public company when I see it, and that's my job then on the micro bottom-up side, having identified the winning sectors. We then visit these companies across Russia. I've probably been to more companies in more places than all but a few people, and I meet with the managements and love factory tours. And so I can tell you that there are a lot of investor-friendly, transparent public companies audited by PricewaterhouseCoopers with young management you would find indistinguishable from the best of what you meet in America. So then that's our job to pick the winners within those winning sectors. We never do sector allocation. In other words, if we decide we want 20% in telecom, we do not put 2% in each of 10 telecom companies. We try to pick the 2 or 3 winners within that sector. And obviously, we've had a very good track record because for the last 10 years, we've averaged each and every year over 20% return a year, which makes us the number 23 mutual fund in America out of 7,500. So the detail, there's more detail. If you're really taken by the steel story, please read Out of the Red. And also we have a blog where we talk about these companies. Russia taking stock. So that's the mutual fund. The more generalized point is that the U.S. helped set up a regulatory system like the SEC in the 1990s. And it's a great system over there. It's I like our system when the regulator actually regulates, which is another problem. But most of these civil code countries, they have line ministries who take over this kind of function. Russia followed our example, our advice. They set up an independent SEC type regulator, and they have quarterly financials published, fully audited, not in the quarter, but on the year, by these companies I mentioned, Ernst & Young and Deloitte and so forth. And they have annual meetings, and the disclosure and the quality of the reporting to the investors is, I think, world class. So, in summary, you have the rising middle class with public companies addressing retail, cell phones, and other businesses, and of course shepherding Russia's colossal commodity exports. They're number one in the world for commodity exports, starting with oil, of course, and gas, and then when you add in all the others. That money, that cash flow, then has come back into the domestic market. So a lot of our favorite stocks are retail stocks. They've got stores in Russia that make Walmart look like the corner drugstore. You take the family and go in for the day and get lost. It's just amazing. So the last thought I want to mention on the mutual fund front is the Russia discount, and that's what we're talking about tonight. The prevailing negativity. You know, you see someone on the ground, and he says, "Kick me." Do you do it? I mean, what kind of a person are you? And it's so easy to kick Russia. You pay no penalty. The press tells you do it. The think tanks tells you do it. We don't do any direct business together, even though they're the number 7 moving to 6 economy in the world. China has all these importers. You try criticizing China in Washington, and I could mention 10 other countries, including Saudi Arabia, where a woman can't even drive a car. And some U.S. senator, former now lobbyist, will come up and say, "Now, John, be nice. They're our friends. We need their oil." They are not our friends. And we won't get into Wahhabi Islam and what it's done to Indonesia and so forth. But, they are not at the top of our list. But so the point is, it's very hard to see the truth about Russia because nobody's telling you the truth, except all of us here tonight. We're going to dialogue the truth, right? But lastly, I just want to say there are some very bad apples in this barrel. And the EBRD, which is the World Bank in Eastern Europe, looks carefully at how the guy made his first million. And if he's a crook, they had nothing to do with him. And it breaks down about 50-50. And there's a favored guy right now who's the aluminum magnate who can't even get a visa to the United States. And that's all I'm going to say about him. But there's some very bad people over there, and so that's part of our job is to avoid these people and only do business with the companies that meet the standards I just mentioned earlier. So in conclusion on this one, I just want to say that, picking stocks abroad generally, I think is a real tough business. Um, as I mentioned earlier today, of all the human beings that ever lived on planet Earth to the age of 65, two-thirds of them are alive today. So, you need a lot of help on your investments. Please use the marvelous portfolio managers like Randy and the others that we have in this country. Especially in foreign stocks, you really need help. It's very hard to pick an individual stock. So this Russia discount is the last thought there. It means that the multiple of the Russian market is 7, moving to 8. India and Brazil, the BRIC countries are Brazil, India, China, Russia. And Brazil and India are 11, 13, and China, of course, is much higher. So if Russia ever gets a proper consideration of the truth about Russia today, that discount will moderate and you'll make money right there. And we generally make money on the ruble because it's generally appreciated against the dollar. It's got the third biggest reserves in the world, so it's a very solid currency. The second company is this Denver-based company, and Dave referred to it in the present tense. We had the rights to a West Siberian brownfield oil property 10 years ago, which we failed to get operating control of. And the new operator promptly squeezed us out of Russia. This was a corrupt practice. He used internal, what they call transfer pricing, to sell the oil to us at through a subsidiary at a price of $11 a barrel, and the world market price at that time, Tom, was you said about 50. We're 60. It was about 60. We were in distress, and we left and started a Rocky Mountain gas company and built a terrific team of people. Unfortunately, our oil play in the Kansas uplift did not come on stream in time to compensate for the collapse of the price of natural gas in the West. The bank line called for more collateral than our reserves then constituted, and the company was done for. So it's in the past tense now. So we did experience the rough play and basically corruption firsthand, and but here again, as mentioned, I've lived and worked in India, and when you talk about corruption, Transparency International puts Russia way down at the bottom. I just got to say again, being from New Jersey, I know what it is, and Russia's just not that bad. There's never been a mafia in Russia. Maybe they can gin one up. I don't know about that, but there is corruption, yes, but it's not as bad as the rankings indicate. And there are countries that are much more corrupt, like India, and also East Africa is not real great. Corruption is mainly at the local level. Famous investor named Bill Browder, who got kicked out of the country because the Minister of Finance said he was the most obnoxious person he'd ever met, and he was suing everybody and his brother. And he goes on TV all the time and has massive PR calling all the top leaders in Russia criminals. And the criminal activity of which he complains was mid-level, lower-level people that he had to deal with. And by the way, he gave up his American citizenship to avoid paying taxes in this country. And the way he earned his money was a quasi-legal scheme to buy government T-bills back in the day when it was illegal for foreigners to own them. And I know because I was a local insurance company, we'll get to that in a minute, and therefore I was a Russian. And we had a hedge fund and we made lots of money, but we were Russians. He was not. Anyway, that's show business. But corruption locally, many of you may have heard negatively about how the Kremlin took back the election of governors locally in Russia. This was largely due to incompetence and corruption, and they go together frequently. I find some of my most corrupt friends are just really incompetent. Yet if they learn to, hold a job and work honestly, they might not need to be corrupt. Any event, there is a charity which Tom Pickering, who was American ambassador, and many Americans support. It's called the Moscow School of Political Studies. This is an annual report, which anyone who wants to can look at. This is the graduating class a couple of years ago. It's about 200 people. They're all mid-level bureaucrats from across the Russian Federation who are brought in to be taught how to operate in a representative form of government. You know, democracy is like opera. You've got to learn it. It doesn't, you know, you can dump on it, but you've got to give it a chance. You've got to work at it. You've got to learn it. You've got to participate. This is a great country, but, you know, unless you wandered into a local ward club and offered your services and your candidacy or something and tried to participate in your party, you may never have really understood how the system actually works in America, and it does. And this is the function of so-called NGOs like this that are all over Russia today. And so this is the problem, is corruption on the local level. And it is being addressed. They put thousands of people in jail every year. They just passed a law, first reading the other day, that's going to now force people to pay a fine. I think they're finally going to get people's attention with this one. And I'm ashamed to say I can't remember if it's 10 times the amount of the bribe or the extortion or 100 times. But it's a big number in Russia. And if they actually get going with this, it'll be a big help in stopping corruption. And as I say, being from New Jersey, this is something I know a lot about. You know, my wife's from Michigan; they don't know much about it there. My mother's from Wisconsin; they know nothing about it over there. So, anyway, one last point on the. Well, I'm talking about the oil company. Is another misconception people have is the private-public split in Russia. It's true they have renationalized some assets, but as I mentioned, the steel industry, for example, is totally private. Fertilizer, big business, totally private. Retail, totally private. And the oil and gas industry in Russia is heavily private. Some of them are totally private, like Lukoil. And then even a company like Gazprom has 40% public stockholders today. So even though it's a state company, we can participate. And recently, because of the Japan situation, Gazprom's become a hot stock. My point is that the Russian economy overall is more private than Italy or France. And that's a fact. And finally, the oil curse, which is the experience that many of these oil-rich countries have where the oil proceeds go into the pockets of the elite. This is not at all a problem in Russia. The state takes a huge amount. That's where the reserves come from. So, you know, we investors get a fair share, and some of my oil companies pay incredible dividends. So much for Teton and oil. Then we come to the one closest to my heart, which was life insurance. When Yeltsin passed the insurance enabling legislation in 1992, we launched a life insurance company in the Russian domestic market. With our partner was the All Russian Blind Association. They were war heroes generally, and they were in most of the cities of Russia, and they were great partners. Didn't know anything about life insurance. We had Lincoln National that put us in business as the reinsurer. They kind of set you up. And our modest name was Great America Life of Russia, or Rosgal. By 1998, you can see where this is going. We had 100 full-time employees, the full floor of a building downtown Moscow, 300 sales agents. We were in 10 cities nationwide, and we were competing toe-to-toe successfully with AIG, which in those days was a great company. Unfortunately, the Russian economy collapsed in the crisis, and our assets were T-bills. Mostly I had some stocks, as mentioned, but we slowly went out of business. And that broke my heart because there were just a lot of great people in Rosgal. But during our good years, we had no troubles with our regulator or any other government agencies, never paid anybody a bribe. And in fact, my perception was generally that the Russian government was bending over backwards to welcome the American investors in the domestic market and was wide open to us. And generally, I think you'll find that in terms of FDI, foreign direct investments, the big companies like John Deere, and they never pay bribes. They're untouchable. And whether it's a private company like Mars Bars or it's Ford Motor, they're just sailing along. The government's so happy to have them there. The consumers are so happy to have the quality of the products. So, finishing up then on this regulatory government policy front with the insurance company is the theme here. They had instituted a new constitution based on that of the French Fifth Republic from 1958 over there. And as mentioned with Yeltsin, they had let go of the historic territories of the Russian Empire. And at that time, as mentioned, they had the economic collapse. Yeltsin was reelected in 1996 with the help of the oligarchs, who then started to throw their weight around, improperly, and that's why Yeltsin went through a series of young men till he found somebody he felt was strong enough to stand up to these guys, and that was Vladimir Putin. So Putin came in, and he did restore order, and the other big event at that time was the passing of a flat income tax at the 13% rate, which is not even a good tip to the government. So the revenues of the government went up like a rocket, and they came back into balance, and they had worked through the crisis at that point. But on the political front, just to finish off on that point, they used the British system over there. And this, I think you will find a shocker, because I doubt anybody in the room has ever heard this. If you get a certain threshold in the polls, and there are 4 parties who qualify, 4, not 2, not 3, 4, and they each command substantial support in the polls, you get free TV time before the elections. Huge amounts of free TV time, as in the UK. And when you think of our system, where before an election we raise huge amounts of money for 30-second spots, and our TV and radio and newspapers and billboards charge disproportionately high rates at that time to the political system, which in the case of the public media, they're licensed by the authorities. But those of us in politics would have to pay disproportionately high rates. So in Russia, I'm listening ad nauseum to the head of the Communist Party, Zhuganov, who can't even speak Russian properly, intone about the good old days of communism. And there it is. Now, how many people understand that? The fact is, of course, that when it comes to TV on a routine basis, it is heavily managed by the Kremlin. That's a fact. And it's very hard to get any other viewpoint out. But the newspapers and the internet are totally free. And I'll come to that a little bit more when I talk about the internet company. It's a shame that Putin, not being a politician, he's a bureaucrat. Yeltsin and Gorbachev were politicians. They came up through the ranks. I mean, the nice thing about a George W. or a Bill Clinton is they've been listening for a long time to people make their points. So they know not to give people the back of the hand and to gratuitously alienate people. They're professional politicians, which personally I think is very important, to have people who are adept at listening. We have a new governor in Florida who's never been in politics before, and he's not even listening to his Senate and Assembly of the same party. And they're very, very upset about this. He seems to think that being the governor, he just runs the show. So people who've come up through the system, any system, the corporate system, the school system, any profession you're in, if you've learned to listen as you come up, and the importance of different viewpoints and constituencies, as it were, that's not Putin and that's not Medvedev. They're bureaucrats. You get the soft, limp wrist. They're looking at the next guy down the line. And when it comes to public demonstrations, they just don't get it. It doesn't hurt if you get a couple of hundred people out there making noise, saying you're a bum. So have things slipped backwards under Putin? Yes. And the present elite, is not as democratically oriented as Yeltsin was during, unfortunately, a failed time. when the crisis meant that the economy collapsed. Do they rank with the other middle groupings that I mentioned, Mexico, Argentina, and Turkey? You decide. But should they be placed by Freedom House and these other people who rank based on political systems way at the bottom in the world, down with Somalia and countries like this? I don't think so. And why does this happen? Again, I'd come back to the fact that they have no friends in court, because this is a country where they have no stroke. Now, partly this is, of course, their own fault, and as Europeans with an extremely high literacy and cultural level, maybe they should expect more from themselves. As I mentioned, they're pretty tough when it comes to public protest. So will civil society develop at an accelerated rate now that they are free to define their own future? Let's hope so. So the last company I'm going to mention is the Internet company, which we launched in 1998. Again, this is a year that a lot of things happened. Two Russian Americans did a reverse engineering on Hotmail, and we put up this mail service on the Russian internet, and today it's used by 27 million people. And the New York-based venture capitalist, who's actually my partner, brought me in as the first president, and we were headed for an IPO in the early part of the century, or the millennium, this being the third millennium. We asked the underwriter, hey, we got no revenues, no income. He said, don't worry, if you can demonstrate use of proceeds, this will be a successful offering. So we hired 300 kids to do e-commerce, very expensive. And we blew through most of our venture capital before the internet bubble burst. And how many of you lost money on that one? And so we had quite a run, though, but the game was almost over, and the two American groups that owned the company sold out to the two Russian groups. And just before I tell you, as my wife reminds me, I owned 1% of the company, and it just had an IPO in London at the $5 billion mark. So anyway, we did all right. But back to the general themes. The government of Russia never in any way interfered with the internet in Russia. And today, this company, the reason it's up to, it's actually now $7.5 billion market cap, is the guy who ran it, Yuri Milner, who went to Wharton. He's had successful game sites. These kids, you give them a free game, and then they have to pay for upgrades. Making $70 million on games in Russia. And they have three successful Facebook-type social networking sites, all of them highly successful. So in addition to the internet, press journalism in the print sphere in Russia is totally free, and there are twice as many journalists, a country half our size, in Russia as there are in the United States. TV is another story I already mentioned. I just come back to the general theme, which is, the sad fact is that our system is run by lobbyists. And that's the reality in America today. And they don't got none. So a lot of this stuff you simply wouldn't know. So in conclusion, and I hope we can have some Q&A, I'd just like to say that it's not easy doing business in Russia. It's not easy doing business in New Jersey. I don't know about Colorado. I keep circling because I'm a snowbird that goes from Florida to Cape Cod, and I only pass through New Jersey quickly in my later years. But I feel a free person is a polled sentiment since 1992, when 42% of the population of Russia said yes. Today it's 70%. So I can tell you firsthand, people will say anything, anywhere. And if you want to hear something negative about Russia, just ask a Russian. They're delighted to tell you what a terrible place it is. And that's understandable after years of Joe Stalin and so forth. So the final thoughts are that there are things we can do, starting with do no harm. And the think tanks are really very negative. They constantly feed the media. I see the cycles. You have your academics who go to Russia and they talk to their Russian academic friends and they hear this. I spent a boat. I did the Valdai discussion group with Putin for 3 days. And I thought I was going to blow my brains out on the boat with these Russian media people. They are so negative about everything. And of course, the thing I find interesting about American journalists, you'll get some guy who's from some place with nothing about the local politics or the local business practices in his own home state, and then he'll go abroad and pass judgment on what's going on over there because he read some book by Richard Pipes or somebody who's a professor in Harvard. His name happens to be Popinski, and he hates Russians. And this has been going on in this country for a long, long time, and nobody calls these people off. So again, we're looking at a country that's made tremendous progress. They switched sides. What kind of and if you look at this map, you might see that they're trying to be like us, but they got a problem. Siberia is between Europe and the Russian Far East. So if you've ever seen an official map in a Russian government office, which is ubiquitous, it's shaped like a hot dog. And European Russia is just this tiny little thing with the Black Sea pointing west. I mean, it's ridiculous. So I thought I'd do them a favor and redraw their map so they could get, with Americans, let's face it, we try to be helpful. I mean, I go down to Ukraine, which I also invest in, and their national slogan was, "We're not dead yet." So we've been working on that, and we have a couple of candidates, and they're making some progress. With Russia, it's got to be that map. So anyway, we're hoping that this year they will finally, after 16 years, join the World Trade Organization. See, the oligarchs have a deal. They've carved the country up for their own benefit. They don't want to join the WTO and have foreigners come in. Everybody's afraid of foreigners. Well, for India, it worked out very well. It turns out Indian companies moved out into the world, and they've done very well. I think Russians will do the same. Today, the biggest manufacturer in UK is Tata. And the Indians were scared to death about coming out into the world. They thought the foreigners would come in and clean their clocks. Well, I'll tell you, there are a lot of smart young Russians, and they're going to do very well if they get the chance. And I think joining the World Trade Organization will be part of it. So this has been, I apologize for being so positive, so I've got to end on a negative note. The Russians have a cultural tendency to stagnate. Once they get something, they think it's set to their satisfaction. They just don't want to change it. Things lose steam, momentum frees up. It's a cultural trait. I can remember the head of Xerox at the time saying, hey, 40% of my products are invented within the last 3 years. If I don't keep putting myself out of business, my competitor's going to do it. Well, the Russians don't think that way. They think, you make a nice car, you finally get it looking the way you like it to look, so let's not look under the hood for the next 20 years. And I don't know what to say except they've got to deal with this. You see it in the lack of turnover in positions at the top, not just in government. We're used to this mind-numbing turnover of people in our elective offices, in our corporate life, and every sphere of life in America is just this constant change, and we can deal with it. So there's a happy medium, but in Russia, and my final example is religion. You get these idealistic Christian sects who go over to Russia. There's 4 religions recognized. It's a secular country, but they have a law and religion. And every madrasi, by the way, gets a little stipend. Some PhD should write a thesis on this one. I've never seen it anywhere. And the State Committee on Religion gets to get a peek at their curriculum every year. And there's a head Nazir, I forget what his title is. There's a head rabbi, and of course the patriarch, and I forget what the Buddhist guy is called, probably just monk, main monk. But Kalmykia down on the Caspian is a 2,000-year-old Buddhist. So anyway, these evangelicals, Baptists show up at the border and they say, we're here to preach Christianity. And the Russian government says, hey, great, we got it. It's called orthodoxy. Go back where you came from. Anyway, thank you very much. So I'm hoping we have some questions.
I have some relatives who are Russian, born and raised. My cousin came over to visit us in 87 or 89, somewhere in there. We took him to the grocery store, and he was like, did you put this here just for me? And he went to visit my parents outside of Chicago, and my father said, well, come with me. I was going to buy a new car. And he's like, buy a new car? How do you get a new car? I mean, I was kind of wondering, well, you said that they have stores that are bigger than Walmart or whatever. So when did this happen? That all of a sudden...
It happened the day Boris Yeltsin freed prices. And they gave everybody their apartments, so the Russians have no cost of occupancy.
When was that?
In the early 90s. Just after, unfortunate, the guy, I hope he went home to benefit from all this.
Yeah,
but,
he did.
So they gave everybody their apartments, so people have tremendous amounts of disposable income, and they spend it. And the retail sector of my hottest company right now is Magnit, MGNT. Oh, please, buy the fund instead, okay? And they've got 10,000 outlets. They're going to be 20,000 by 2020. And still, when you aggregate the top retailers in Russia, it's only 10% of retail. So it's not consolidated. They haven't done the roll-ups we've seen in this country, where things are much more concentrated at this point. But they are very happy consumers over there. They're able to buy things that they never dreamed they'd ever own. And as you say, there was nothing in the old system. The manager of the outlet would get their quota of goods at the beginning of the month. They would sell them all on the black market and make their numbers. Everything was the plan. If you made your numbers, you were home free. So they literally didn't even work the rest of the month. So that's why you went into a restaurant and there was nothing on the menu. You had this long menu and 99% of it was not available because it had been sold on Naleva out the door on the left. The system was, you couldn't design, if you were trying to torture human beings but keep them alive, you couldn't have designed a more dysfunctional system.
So characteristic of the Russian psyche you brought up.
No, I didn't say that. I'm Irish. Everything is up.
But characteristic of their psyche, they seem to like to fight like crabs in a bucket. And I'm going to ask you a question about that in a minute because it's important to us since we're looking for an investment vehicle in Russia. But I hope before the night is over you'll tell us where you landed in the Cape because that's also interesting. A quick observation, then a question. As you know, Sechin has been courting foreign direct investment as well.
This is one of the deputy prime minister in the Kremlin.
As well as Western oil executives and technology to help to develop that rich deposits, the ready markets, these immersed. And as you mentioned, there may be an upcoming middle class, but there are commissars and oligarchs that are still picking at the pie That worries me. And as an investor in Russia, where do you see the real risks? And is the state one of those risks, and or the remaining homicides?
That's a really good question. The problem with looking at a problem with friendly eyes is you're a prisoner of your own experience. Um, the Russian oligarchs, to give you an example, nobody got this. Nobody had a Russian, and I will agree with your characterization. There are things Russian, and control, lack of trust, is one of them. Like oligarch wants to own his company. You know, we understand. I start out owning 30% of modest company. I'd rather end up owning 8% of a really big successful company. But they want to keep that control at the 40, 50, 60, 80% level. And then they borrowed heavily against their own positions, unknown to everybody. It wasn't just myself that missed it, because it didn't occur to us that they'd never heard the word diversification, for example, which is a mantra of American investing. And even today, I keep several pharmaceutical stocks just because I think the companies are good, well-run, vital. People are spending more on, but the stocks are, not performing. But I'm still in them. Anyway, the point is, the Russian oligarchs have a different, the brain. They look like us, but their brains are wired differently. And it's very hard to see where the next problem would be. Look at America. Did we see with this euphoria, and Alan Greenspan keeps saying interest rates low and the market will correct itself? Huh? No. There were very few people. I remember Greenspan saying to the camera when people said, but people had written books and people had made bets and they knew. And he said, nobody I talked to, nobody I listened to told me. So the point is, we missed some pretty big things over here. So as a foreigner, I would say, look, there's some things that are clear as the nose on my face, and that is, as wealth or development moved from in my lifetime to the southeast United States and the southwest United States, southern Russia, along the Black Sea Rim, great properties. There's going to be great development there. They're going to be, when they built the metro in Washington, we knew that in every stop there was going to be a small city. I mean, there's so many things that you could see just by thinking about what you've experienced in the United States in your lifetime. Tourism, domestically in Russia, hotels, restaurants, these things are going to happen. Now, timing is everything in investments. And if you pick the wrong location and you're premature and this sort of thing. I had a cousin who was into prefab housing 10 years too soon, that sort of thing, and went out of business. So there are plenty of investment opportunities, plenty. And I think it's very exciting in that part of the world because that middle class is just coming up rapidly from that low base. And they want all the things we want, cars and homes, homes and cars. And they're highly educated, and the young people are indistinguishable from what you see in our country. So it's very exciting. And that's why I've started another fund called Frontier Europe Fund, the Black Sea Rim. But I'm totally energized. Keep in mind, I don't even like the Russians. I like the French and the British, and vacation over there. But just what's happening in that part of the world is so exciting. You can hardly not be involved. We have an oil development in Crimea, which is an old oil patch. And there's just so many things to invest in. But obviously you have to pick and choose. How many of you are willing to pick up tomorrow and move to Eastern Europe to take advantage of these tremendous developments? You guys won't even move to New Jersey. Come on, be honest. Yes, sir.
I got the mic. You express a very, very positive view toward what's going on in Russia at the present time. And I really don't dispute that, but I thought I learned a lot from that, what you were saying tonight. But nevertheless, we've got our CIA that is very effective, of course, we know all around the world. And they don't seem to have picked this up and conveying things to the American government, because I think we see the foreign policy disputes between the United States and Russia seem to be always a disaster. And things improve, but on the other hand, then they go back to another disaster. I'm wondering why it is, in your view, that we seem to have such rough edges on our foreign policy.
Okay, well, actually, the Americans are working very closely with the Russians on a number of fronts nowadays. You don't read about good news, but in Iran, I could, go into great detail about Iran and the mutual cooperation. The kids in the CIA, I used to administer an intelligence function in the government, and I always think to myself, who am I talking to when I meet the journalist or the analyst? What life experience have they had? Okay, they've read a lot, but in terms of the rubber meeting the road, do they really understand how things work? And I think that's often the problem. When Jack Matlock, who was ambassador and with Reagan in Reykjavik, wrote a book called Autopsy on an Empire. He's summa cum laude graduate of Duke University, career Foreign Service officer. He said that, when we went into Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we discovered this carcass that was not at all what the CIA had been telling us for years. And, I'm all for great defense initiatives, and if there's a new tech, we got to have it. But we spend more on military than the whole rest of the world combined. And yet, look at some of the we didn't know the difference between the Sunni and the Shia. Look at the mistakes we've made with all of our learning, and who can you trust? And more importantly, who knows? Getting the right source. Who knew that the oligarchs were leveraged to the hilt, and they had to destroy their own stocks, and you were sitting there holding them. So actually knowing what questions to ask and understanding things when you hear them, this is not easy. And we don't seem to do it very well. I'm not sure we're really very good listeners. And I think most people go into things with preconceptions, and it's very hard for them to really take in what they're looking at. I remember going back to India as a tourist with my wife. I finally took my wife to India. I wooed her and won her with stories of India and all this stuff. We were classmates in law school, but her income was so valuable to me, I would never want to take her to India while she was working. And we had kids to raise. I couldn't do that myself. So finally, I took her to India. We went there 3 times in a row, and I was reminded of the realities that I'd forgotten about because I'd lived there and seen it and understood it. And all I can say is you cannot understand the caste system. It's beyond your comprehension. And I can give you particular examples of how it works in practice that most Americans, we're just not wired to take it in. So, well, India has changed a lot, but it is a tremendously, deeply corrupt system. But everybody has their function. That's what the caste system is. And if there are 2,000, and I hate to digress because I'm here to talk about Russia, but there are 2,000 subcastes, and in any given location there are 200. And if you're 40 subcastes above you, you are not dealing with a human being, you're dealing with a god. 40 subcastes below you, you're not dealing with a human being, you're dealing with an animal. And just to put this in Thomas Jefferson, and what was the name of that good-looking slave that he slept with terms? Sally, yeah, this means that your buddy would not touch this gorgeous woman who I can see. And I say to my buddy, I was a young man, unmarried, what's it like having her in the house? And he literally didn't know what I was talking about. So, this is certainly beyond my comprehension. I don't know about the rest of you guys. But, we go to these places in the world and we think we see things and we think we understand them. We don't. And I don't know what to do about that. It's a problem because people at the top have to make decisions. Okay, I'm sorry. I think we have a problem here.
Would you care to comment on the fact that there's been a long series of Russian journalists who have either been murdered or severely beaten, because they criticize the government apparently, and there's been the police in Russia have not solved any of these crimes.
Yeah, this is a real problem. There's a little bit, I used to see it in corporate America, there's a little bit of this piling on mentality. When the CEO says something, the lower echelon kind of thinks they know what his desires are, and they do things they think that he wants them to do. And so when someone becomes at odds with the top people, and this is part of the problem with bureaucrats at the top as opposed to politicians. Politicians are much more careful in what they say because they understand the implications of what they say. Bureaucrats, I can't tell you how many times Yeltsin has given someone the back of the hand, and then, a month later, he's finally made to understand the implications of what he did. So you get a lot of this middle-level government official acting in a manner which they wouldn't normally do, except for the fact that they think this, it's back to the moral question of kicking someone when they're down. And journalism is very hard to discuss because they have two extremes we do not have. I think most of us in this room think we know what a journalist is. And if, a journalist comes into a city desk with a story, Dave is a crook, his editor is going to say, well, what corroboration do you have? Well, I talked to Jeff, and Jeff said Dave's a crook. And so the city editor is going to say, well, hey, let's get a couple more, let's corroborate this before we put it in the newspaper. Well, that doesn't happen in Russia. You get people who publish any damn thing. And by the way, the other extreme is, if you want something nice about your company, you just give the journalist $1,000, and there the 3 paragraphs you wrote, there it is. So those are two extremes we don't have in this country. And I'm not excusing the murder of anybody, but you've got kids who show up in Moscow and they want to make a name for themselves, so they figure the way to do it is they take on some big shot. And this has nothing to do with the government. Nothing to do with the government. But they put this stuff in a publication, and guess what? That big shot is a very brutal person. They forgot to check with the EBRD about how he made his first million. And they pay the consequences. And, it's terrible, but people get murdered all the time. Russia is a very tough place. Personally, I don't go to casinos at 2 a.m. I'm tucked in bed at 11 something. I've seen dead bodies in Russia, and not in New Jersey.
I wonder if you could comment on a couple of things. One, relating to Putin. The American press has characterized him as corrupt. Right? That's what stories of skimmed hundreds of millions of dollars from the mayor saying. I'm sorry. And secondly, could you explain the relationship between Putin in terms of the power he actually exercises and Medvedev?
It means bear. It's the Russian word for bear.
I don't understand. Could you explain what the real politics is? How much power Putin really exercises in the Russian president?
Okay, well, if you could tell me what the relationship was between Ronald Reagan and Jim Baker or George Shultz, it's a tandem group. And in the beginning, I don't know if you remember, but all the journalists were saying there can only be one czar in Russia. And then I think I was the first one. I'm on TV quite a bit. I said, well, I remember being there when Brezhnev and Kosygin worked very well together for 12 years. And Brezhnev was the boss, yes, but Kosygin ran the government day to day and was pretty sharp cookie. And, oh, yeah, well, I guess, they could have two. They worked very closely together. I preferred Medvedev. He's a more modern thinking person. I think Putin's kind of tired and cranky. And I think generally anybody in any top job after 10 years has kind of shot their wad. And I earnestly hope he will not be the next president of Russia. But this corruption thing, I'm quite certain that Yeltsin was never corrupt. And I can't say what skimming or anything anybody's done. My general impression is that the top people in Russia are very honest. Minister Alexei Kudrin is the best finance minister in the world. I've talked to him many times. I would be astounded if he was corrupt. So are there bad people? Yeah, I have a friend, a long-standing friend I worked with in the 70s in the Trade Council that Dave mentioned, who all of a sudden is living high, just as of about 6 years ago. And I guess he got sick of seeing all the oligarchs and stuff, and he was in the telecommunications ministry and decided maybe I have no idea where he got this money. He's been in the government, in Trade Council, and then government work his whole life. So where he gets off driving Audis and living in a big house now, I have no idea. So it's probably suspect. But who knows?
You seem very optimistic about the rising middle class. You seem very optimistic about the rising middle class, no doubt interfaced with a lot of them. What are their perceptions or misperceptions of us?
Well, you saw the quote about they feel free. They admire us tremendously. That's one reason I put Russia in the form of the United States, with Siberia, where everybody lives on a southern border just like Canada, and actually the same population. They really admire the Americans, like many places around the world. They emulate our dress, our music, but they are their own people. But I really think America has generally been a very positive part of the picture in the last 3 decades, and I hope we continue to be so. But I think, we are the shining whatever it is on the hill, even today, after all our missteps. And I really think, I know when I speak over there, I have a very good reputation. And I know that when the business community goes over there and they have their little working groups on, these outstanding companies, they form up and do a white paper for the Ministry of Finance on some subject of interest to foreign investors. And it's taken very seriously. This guy's Mr. GM, this guy's Mr. GE, and John Deere, and so forth. And they really admire the Americans, even when we're not acting our best. I remember the head of Johnson & Johnson once came in and was pounding the table, and the pinstripe people from the State Department were horrified, but the Russians loved it.
Okay. Yeah, we have time for one more, and this gentleman's had his hand up for a while.
My limited experience behind the Iron Curtain, the service sectors, the medical care were quite different. Can you hear me? Were very poor, and there was no desire to work. Where does that all sit today as the general population? In other words, do they still not work on some days because they don't want to?
Well, I had 100 full-time employees in my insurance company, and it was a hard-working bunch. And I've worked in law offices over there. I used to be, before I became a real person, I was an attorney. And, my impression is that the young kids are very hardworking, very motivated. They speak English, they speak French, they speak German. They've lived and worked. They've gone to Wharton. I mentioned Yuri Milner is the head of the Mail.ru company, went to Wharton. So I'm very admiring of their work ethic today. I agree that historically they used to say, the state pretends to pay us and we pretend to work. And that was, back, as I mentioned, with the Soviet system, was just a totally dysfunctional system. Anyway, thank you very much.